Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dungeon Dive. Daniel here, and welcome back to the Sword and Sorcery Saga series. And today we're going to be taking a look at a work of Sword and Planet, and that is Henry Kuttner's The Dark World. Now, Sword and Planet, as I mentioned in my introduction to this series, is kind of Sword and Sorcery's older brother, you could say. Probably started with Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars books. Maybe there are earlier examples that I'm not aware of or will discover. But these are usually stories in which a man from Earth, from our world, is transported, spirited away, teleported into a fantastical world. And this is a kind of a premier example of Sword and Planet. And this is a pretty interesting book. It was originally published in 1946. And here you can see this old Ace paperback version. This is my collector's, my version I keep on the shelf. This is in really poor condition. The pages, the binding is almost completely broken. The pages are falling out. I probably need to invest in a better version of this book here. But the original synopsis is: it started when Edward Bond was visited in the night by a giant wolf and a shadowy hooded figure, and felt the compelling call of the need fire, or perhaps the real start had been eons before, for Bond was thrust into a strange other world, which had branched off from his own Earth thousands of years ago, a world where an ages-long battle of science and sorcery still raged, and where Bond himself was in some mysterious way the focus of powers and forces beyond his imagining. Writing in the New York Herald Tribune, Anthony Boucher, another author, considered Harry Kuttner to be among the most imaginative, technically skilled, and literarily adroit science fantasy writers. So a work of science fantasy. That is kind of another way that Sword and Planet stories are sometimes defined. This is my reading copy here, and this is from the Planet Stories series, which was a offshoot of Paizo Publishing, and they reissued a whole bunch of great old pulp Sword and Planet and Sword and Sorcery and fantasy and science fiction stories into this Planet Stories imprint. And this version has an introduction by Pierce Anthony. One thing you can tell right off the bat is just how much better the old cover is. This cover is really, really bad, and just not quite sure what Planet Stories was thinking. They obviously didn't put a lot of thought into their covers. This old cover is just much more evocative and powerful and mysterious. But let's see what the back of this newer version says. Edward Bond is not alone in his mind. Haunted by strange events during the war, he returns home to discover he now shares his body with an identical twin from an alternate dimension, the evil wizard Ganelon. Sucked through a portal to the dark world, Bond finds himself trapped between two warring factions. On one side is the Coven. The Coven. If you guys have seen American movie, you realize why I sometimes call that Coven. Pretty funny. Yep. A werewolf, an immortal, and a beautiful witch eager to acknowledge Ganelon as their sinister ruler. On the other side is the white sorceress Freitas and her band of forest rebels that want nothing more than to see the warlock's head on a spike. Will Edward Ganelon join with the rebels to release the oppressed world from the grip of a tyrannical, sacrifice-hungry god, or embrace the Coven to become the world's greatest villain? So yeah, it's a pretty interesting work. So you do have, it takes place after World War II. You have this character named Edward Bond who was a pilot in World War II, and he crash landed on this island, I believe, towards the end of the war, and he gets prophesied over that he's some chosen one, and he is goes back to his home, and then he notices this fire, and he gets whisked away through the fire into this dark world where he learns that he is actually this evil sorcerer, this evil warlock named Ganelon. And Edward Bond, the good version of himself, is whisked away to Earth, and they have traded places. And the most, about 90% of this book, our point of view protagonist is actually Ganelon, the evil one, the bad guy. And so that right there kind of makes this a little more interesting, or a little different than a lot of heroic fiction. The book is not told from the point of view of the good hero. Kind of places this more into the work of maybe Vance's Dying Earth series. A lot of those stories seem to be from the point of view of an antagonist, of a bad guy. But he gets teleported to this world. He finds out that he is the ruler of this coven, this group of wizards, of sorcerers, of vampires, of werewolves, and he is the antagonist of this forest-dwelling people. Now, what's interesting is, like, the forest-dwelling people, the rebels as they are not, it's not a typical forest-dwelling community where they are one with nature and they fight with, like, wood and swords and spears. No, the forest dwellers in this, they are actually armed with, like, machine guns and grenades, and they are fighting against the more of, like, the supernatural entities. But what we learn is that it actually is a war of science versus superstition, because what we learn throughout the book is that the sorcerers, the werewolves, the vampires, the magic of the world really isn't magic. What they are biological mutations. And Ganelon, the evil sorcerer, retains some of the memories of his earthbound twin, what was his name? Edward Bond. And he learns to contextualize the magic, the symbology, the symbolism, the superstition of the world through a lens of science, and starts to see that these acts of magic are really not acts of magic, but are indeed acts of science. And so you have this conflict that erupts in the world between science and superstition. And that is another kind of trope of Sword and Planet stories, where you usually end up with these battles between science and superstition. So that is kind of an interesting take, and I think it does seem to be the focus of Dark World. And there is a monologue from this old being here that starts on page 110 of this. That is quite interesting, I think, and it kind of puts the book, you kind of learn about, I think, what the main theme, the main thrust of the narrative is here. I'm not going to read it because it does kind of give away quite a bit of what is going on in the book, but I thought it was pretty interesting, and is by far the most interesting thing about the book. The book itself, I don't think it's one of my favorite from Kuttner. I like his Alec stuff better. His Alec of Atlantis. We talked a little bit about some of those stories in my last Sword and Sorcery video, and I do prefer those stories. This there's not a lot of momentum in this story. Ganelon, he gets teleported from Earth to the Dark World, and then he just he doesn't go very many places. And I like fantasy where there is a lot of travel, where we get a quest, where we get a lot of movement. And in this book, they kind of seem to just kind of stay relatively close, in close proximity to one geographical location. And we don't get a real sense of the world, of the way it's laid out. It's more concerned with kind of this, almost this political structure between, or political conflict between the two warring factions, and how Ganelon is betrayed by one, joins with the other in the hopes of betraying them, to pit the two against each other and to become the ultimate ruler of the Dark World. But there are double crosses and triple crosses, and things don't end up going exactly to Ganelon's plan. And the end has a nice little twist, and I think it wraps up nicely. I was just hoping for a little bit more. I think it is pretty well written. There are, of course, a lot of exclamation points, like pages of where it seems like every other sentence ends in an exclamation point. And it's funny, Piers Anthony actually talks a little bit about that in his introduction, how there are a ton of exclamation points in the book. But that, of course, was a style of the pulps to really punctuate their sentences with a lot of with a lot of exclamation points. So just know that going into it, that it is a lot of people boasting and bragging and shouting and being boastful and just being boisterous. That is a trope of Sword and Sorcery and Sword and Planet. But overall, I do think it's worth checking out. It's pretty short. It's 130 pages in this version. One other complaint I have is there are a lot of named characters in that 130 pages. It seems like there's like a dozen or so named characters, and hardly any of them really have any great sense of character development. I feel like a few of them could have been combined into one way more interesting character, and it is kind of hard by the end of the book trying to keep track of who's who, just because you don't really get any real sense of development of who these characters actually are besides what faction they belong to. So I think it would have been better if they had just had maybe half as many named characters. It would have been a little easier to keep track of. And it does, if you stop and really think about how the main character, Edward Bond and Ganelon, are connected, it kind of starts to fall apart. So it's better if you don't really think about like how this is actually working or the intricacies of that relationship, and you just kind of suspend your disbelief and go along with the fantastical story at hand. I think you will fare much better in your opinion of the book. But I'm really glad to have read it. I think it is an interesting entry into the Sword and Planet. It's short, it's not part of a series, and so you get I think a pretty satisfactory read that you can read in just a couple days, and you get a good conclusion to the story. I just wish it was developed a little more, and I wish there was just a little more exploration of the dark world itself, because I think that is the most fascinating part about the book, this war between science and superstition, and how like the monsters like vampires and werewolves, they're not actually these mythological beings. They are mutants. They are biological anomalies, mutations. So that is, I think, the most interesting part of the book, but unfortunately it's also a part of the book that isn't explored as deeply as I would like. So alright guys, well, I hope you enjoyed this latest entry into the Sword and Sorcery Saga series, and we will be back with more. So have a good one. Talk to you later. Bye bye.